Chapter 3. Matter and Consciousness. The world consists of what is, or can be, known or perceived. There is no other world, obviously, that we know or can know anything about. But what is this act of knowing, which is so important? Every act of knowing involves three aspects, which we cannot avoid, and under which, by the present nature of our minds, we are forced to regard it. There is 1. The knower or perceiver, 2. The knowledge or perception, 3. The thing to be known or perceived. I say we cannot imagine the act of knowledge or perception except in this triple form. For the first analysis of the conception of knowledge implies and compels the thought of a knower, either oneself or someone else. If it is our own knowledge, then we cannot avoid the thought of self as the knower. If it is knowledge in some far planet, totally beyond our sphere, still we are forced to think of it as entertained by some being, be it beetle or angel, who is thus the knower. And without some knower, the conception of knowledge is, to us, meaningless. Similarly, the act of knowledge at first analysis yields a thing to be known. We cannot avoid thinking there is something of which we have the knowledge or perception. If an impression is made on our mind, the very word connotes, as Herbert Spencer says, something that impresses as well as something that is impressed. Or in other words, the modification of our mind, which we call knowledge, compels us to look for something which causes the modification. We are startled by a thunderclap. Instantly we ask, what is the thunder? What is behind it? We are told that it is Zeus, or God, or electricity. The answers do not bring us much further, but they indicate the conviction that there is, quote, something. This habit of the mind of positing a something behind and different from the knowledge itself may be foolish, but it is apparently quite inveterate and unavoidable. Though we do not seem able to say what the thing known is, we seem to see quite clearly that it is not the knowledge. Here is a violet. The least thought shows us that the color of the flower is largely in our own sensations, the same of its odor. We know that such colors and smells appeal differently to different eyes and noses. What then is the violet, quote, in itself? We do not know. We are tempted to say that it certainly is not the violet that we see and smell. Yet we are compelled to believe that there is an entity there. And in all our knowledge and perception, whatever it may be, we cannot get over this ascription of an objective side to it, as well as a subjective side. Even in our dreams, those most tenuous phantoms, we are oppressed with the sense of their, quote, reality. The distinction of subject and object is fundamental in our minds. Practically all the philosophers agree in this, and there are not many things that they do agree about. All our knowledge implies and involves these two aspects. There is always an ego side to it, and always a non-ego side. Consciousness, to use the simile of Ferrier, is like a stick. It has two ends, and without the two ends we cannot imagine it. All knowledge, be it great or small, simple or complex, has two poles, the subject and the object. The least atom of the knowledge, as in a magnet, has the same constitution. All our knowledge is saturated and interpenetrated by the union and distinction of subject and object, and we are compelled to think it so. Nevertheless, it need hardly be said, this analysis in young children, animals, and very primitive folk scarcely takes place. The knower, the knowledge, and the thing known are in experience undistinguished, darkly confused together, as it were one. The ego quite dim, only now and then, so to speak, suspected. The thing to be known and the knowledge frankly unseparated. This may be called the state of simple consciousness. Yet again, we, considering it, are compelled, if we believe there is knowledge, to believe also there is a knower and a known, an ego side and an object side, even though these sides in the simple consciousness have not yet become separated. Once then the nature of knowledge, as above indicated, is seized, many things easily follow. In the first place, it is obvious that matter per se, as an independent entity, supposed apart from some act of knowledge, is absolutely unknown to us. Matter, of course, is a general and in its way useful term for the supposed objective entity underlying phenomena and our sensations. I say that to figure this entity as independent and apart from mind is impossible. For knowledge is the subject plus the object plus the subject. It is, and always must be, relative, in some degree, to the subject or ego. Something therefore not relative to any ego or subject, but having an independent, non-mental existence of its own, cannot be known. It cannot even be imagined. The instrument or act of knowledge, being itself partly subjective, can only at best give us information of some joint relation between self and the supposed external entity. And if the, quote, thing outside can exist without relation to any self or ego, all knowledge is absolutely silent about it. If there is an objective and material, quote, violet, existing independent of any conscious mind, either its own or any other, we know and can know nothing whatever about it. It follows, therefore, that all the talk about a mechanical structure of the universe, as of dead matter, which apart from any kind of consciousness, moves in obedience to laws of its own, and all the talk about senseless atoms which fly and spin and collide and rebound, and so by unwitting mechanical or chemical processes build up the world we see, is itself senseless, and may be at once dismissed, not only as having no meaning, but as being incapable of meaning to us. We cannot think such matter or such atoms, and the more we try, the more we see our inability. Atoms there may be, but if we are to think them, we must think them as related to mind, either as being centers of consciousness themselves, or as being outlying elements, or thoughts, in wider systems of consciousness. We may, of course, think them as being our own thoughts about an unknown objective world, which no doubt they, to a large extent, are, or again, we may think them as thoughts conveyed to us by another mind or minds, in which case the objective world is conceived of as mental in character. But as, quote, matter, which might conceivably remain and pursue its course even in a world from which intelligence had departed, we cannot think them. Again, as dead matter is nonsense, so is another term, lately much used, namely, quote, unconscious thought. The very expression is, of course, self-contradictory. If there is thought, there is consciousness of some kind. We cannot imagine it otherwise. In strict language, the expression is nonsense, but loosely we know that it is used to indicate that in sleep and at other times, processes resembling thought seem to go on, either in portions of our minds or bodies or elsewhere, of which we have no consciousness or memory, but of which we use the results. Now of this there may be two interpretations. Either we may suppose conscious thought, or in a strict sense, conscious to our own or to some other self, to be really going on in the region indicated, or we may suppose, and this is the view I think most generally entertained, that non-conscious, cerebral, mechanical, and chemical changes are taking place, which simply turn out, at last, a result translatable, and so made use of, as conscious thought. Now the latter supposition we must dismiss, for we have already seen that non-conscious mechanical and chemical actions convey no meaning to our minds, and are really inconceivable. We are therefore compelled to adopt the former supposition, namely, that, quote, unconscious thought is really conscious thought of some kind, but inherent in or related to another self than our own. And anyhow, it is far simpler and more natural and intelligent to suppose this than to call in by way of explanation a mechanical non-conscious process which, when we come to look into it, proves meaningless and unimaginable to us, and therefore to be no explanation at all. In the third place, from the nature of knowledge it follows that, like matter, the ego, per se, as an independent entity, supposed apart from some act or possible act of knowledge, cannot be even conceived to exist. For the knower, the knowledge, and the known are one from the beginning. And though the one differentiates into three aspects, we cannot separate these aspects. The stick has two ends, but we cannot separate the end from the stick. And if we could, what satisfaction were it to have an end without a stick? Of the ego, we have a consciousness, but only in the act of perception or knowledge, which at the same moment involves the consciousness of the non-ego. When there is no act of knowledge, there is no consciousness of the ego. But as we shall presently see, when the knowledge becomes perfect knowledge, then the consciousness of the self also becomes complete. We cannot be conscious of our ego as unrelated and independent, for consciousness, in the ordinary sense, of course means relation. This consciousness of the ego, present in the act of knowledge, gradually evolves, as we have seen, and becomes distinct. Indeed, it becomes to us the most real thing in the world. It pursues us everywhere. We refer everything to it. Yet it remains curiously simple and unanalyzable. We cannot avoid it, but we cannot analyze it, for the simple reason that as soon as it is envisioned, it becomes the object, and the real ego is found to be again at the hither end of the stick. This action is very curious. However intimate the thought one may entertain, the ego is instantly beneath it, and more intimate, suggesting the idea that it, the ego, is a kind of widely diffused substance of mind, of which thoughts are modifications. Indeed, the idea is suggested that possibly all egos are in essence the same, that they are portions or branches of one universal mind stuff, of which all thoughts and existence are modifications. However, leaving these last considerations aside for the moment, we see this curious fact that while we feel the ego as a simple unity, we are compelled to think it, if we think of it at all, as enormously complex, or at least as having the potentiality of enormous complexity. For obviously the self which entertains or is related to all our knowledge and experience cannot be less complex, or have less potentiality of complexity, than the knowledge and experience to which it is related. Consequently, the self appears at once as a simple monad, and an infinite complexity of possible relations. In the fourth place, having cleared the ground somewhat, the question arises, are we now in a position to get a clearer idea of the non-ego, or of matter? If we have some conception of the nature of the ego, as we are compelled to conceive it, does that throw any light on the nature of the non-ego? If the ego is impressed, what is that unknown thing which impresses it? Or, if the ego enters into relation, what is that correlative unknown thing which enters into relation with it? Or, to put it in the plural, in a world of egos capable of entering into relation, what are the correlative objects? But since there is no such thing as dead matter, the only answer we can think is, the objects are other egos. The egos enter into relation with each other. I say we cannot think otherwise, for we have nothing to place at the other end of the stick, except something similar to what we have at the hither end. We know of nothing else. In all our experience, the self and its knowledge are the only things we know of. We may not be right in our surmise, but if we think at all, we are compelled to think thus. There is a certain probability, besides, that one end of the stick is similar to the other. If subject and object are correlative, as we are forced to think them, then it is hard not to suppose the object similar in nature to the subject. We conceive the subject as a self or intelligence which is one and yet infinitely complex, and it is difficult not to conceive of the correlated object or objects as one or many similar selves, one and yet infinitely complex. The kind of thing which physical science, along its own ways, is constantly searching for and assuming to exist. Thus, as in the last chapter, we arrive at the conclusion that knowledge, perception, consciousness are messages or modes of communication between various selves, words, as it were, by which intelligences come to expression and become known to each other and themselves. All nature, all the actual world, as known to us or any being, we have to conceive as the countless interchange of communication between countless selves. Or, if these selves are really identical, and the one ego underlies all thought and knowledge, then the subject and object are the same, and the world, the whole creation, is self-revealment. In these few remarks on matter and consciousness generally, I have endeavored to set out not so much what is, as what we are compelled to think, as this indeed seems the safer thing to do. How far what we are compelled to think may be taken as evidence of what is another question, which I will not tackle, but which the philosophers deal with. I will only quote the following remark of J.F. Ferrier from the ontology section of his Institutes of Metaphysics. No existence at all can be conceived by any intelligence anterior to and aloof from knowledge. Knowledge of existence, the apprehension of oneself and other things, is alone true existence. This is itself the first, the bottom, the origin, and this is what all intelligence is prevented by the laws of reason from ever getting beyond or below.